At the bustling Port Royal market, a weathered parrot sits forgotten in a rusty cage. The once magnificent bird's feathers are dull, his voice cracked from calling out to indifferent passers-by. Merchants scoff that he's cursed. Children point and laugh at his pitiful squawks. Even the desperate bird seller has given up hope. Captain Ezra Blackwood, a solitary pirate with more scars than friends, watches from the shadows. His crew abandoned him months ago, leaving him with nothing but an empty ship and bitter memories. Something about the rejected parrot stirs recognition in his weathered heart. As the seller prepares to release the bird into the wild, Ezra steps forward. The parrot's intelligent eyes lock with his, and in that moment, two outcasts recognize each other. "You're coming with me," Ezra declares, dropping coins into the startled seller's palm. What ancient secrets does this forgotten parrot guard that will transform a broken pirate's destiny forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The salty breeze carried memories across the harbor as Captain Ezra Blackwood made his way toward the docks, the rusty cage swinging gently in his weathered grip. The parrot inside had fallen silent, those intelligent dark eyes studying everything with an intensity that unsettled most folks. But Ezra found comfort in that steady gaze. It reminded him of his own careful observations from years of surviving by reading faces and situations. His ship, the Siren's Revenge, bobbed alone at the far end of the pier. Once, she had been magnificent, her black sails striking fear into merchant hearts across the Caribbean. Now, barnacles clung to her hull like old regrets, and her rigging showed the wear of a vessel maintained by one man instead of a full crew. Ezra climbed aboard, his boots echoing hollow on the deck that once thundered with the movement of 23 loyal pirates. The silence had become his constant companion these past 6 months. Ever since that cursed morning when he'd awakened to find his ship anchored and empty, his crew vanished, like morning mist. Setting the cage on a crate near the ship's weathered compass, Ezra opened the door with careful movements. The parrot stepped out with dignity, ruffling crimson and gold feathers as he surveyed his new home. "Well then," Ezra said, pulling a piece of hardtack from his pocket, "suppose we should get acquainted proper. I'm Captain Ezra Blackwood, though I admit the title carries less weight than it once did." The parrot tilted his head, fixing Ezra with that penetrating stare. When he spoke, his voice carried surprising clarity and depth. "Crimson," the bird said simply. "Captain Mackenzie always said a name should fit the bearer." Ezra's hand froze halfway to offering the bread. In all his years sailing these waters, he'd never heard a parrot speak with such deliberate precision. Most repeated phrases mindlessly. But this bird, Crimson, had chosen his words. "Mackenzie, you say?" Ezra sat heavily on a nearby barrel. "Ian Mackenzie? Haven't heard that name spoken in 5 years. 5 years, 2 months, 8 days, Crimson corrected, preening a wing feather. Since Torres ran him through with a cutlass on Skull Rock, Mackenzie never saw the betrayal coming. The hardtack crumbled in Ezra's grip. Torres, his former first mate, the man he'd trusted above all others. The same Torres who had led the mutiny that left Ezra stranded and broken. "You knew Mackenzie," Ezra said, the pieces falling into place. "That's why you ended up in that market cage." Crimson bobbed his head. Mackenzie's dying words were about the treasure of 3 moons. Torres heard every syllable, but he never understood that some secrets require more than just listening. Ezra stood, pacing the narrow deck as his mind raced. Ian Mackenzie had been legendary, a pirate's pirate who disappeared suddenly at the height of his power. Rumors had swirled for years about his hidden fortune, but no one had ever found so much as a single doubloon. "This treasure," Ezra said carefully. "You know where Mackenzie hid it?" Crimson's laugh sounded almost human. "I know many things, Captain." Mackenzie understood that memory is the most valuable treasure of all. "He taught me that wisdom shared is wisdom preserved." The afternoon sun painted golden stripes across the deck as Ezra absorbed this revelation. His compass needle spun lazily, pointing nowhere in particular, a fitting metaphor for his rudderless existence since the mutiny. But now, for the first time in months, he felt the stirrings of purpose. The Tortuga Islands, Ezra mused aloud. Taurus was always fascinated by those waters, said they held secrets worth dying for. Some secrets are worth living for, Crimson replied, settling comfortably on his perch. Mackenzie believed that true treasure lies not in gold, but in the stories we carry forward. As evening shadows lengthened across the harbor, Ezra made his decision. The Siren's Revenge might sail with a crew of 2 now, but perhaps that was enough to begin. He'd spent 6 months wallowing in self-pity and bitter memories. Time to remember what it felt like to chase the horizon again. Tomorrow we sail, he announced, feeling conviction strengthen his voice. If Torres wants Mackenzie's secrets, he'll have to go through both of us to get them. Crimson ruffled his feathers approvingly. Now you sound like a captain worth following, Ezra Blackwood. The gentle roll of the ocean beneath the Siren's Revenge brought Ezra peace he'd forgotten existed. 3 days out from Port Royal, with favorable winds filling his patched sails, he found himself talking to Crimson as naturally as he'd once conversed with his human crew. You want to know how I ended up alone on this floating coffin? Ezra asked, adjusting the rigging with practiced hands. The parrot perched on the ship's wheel, occasionally mimicking the creaking sounds of the vessel with uncanny accuracy. Crimson tilted his head. Every captain has storms in their past. Mackenzie used to say the measure of a man lies not in avoiding the tempest, but in how he navigates through it. Ezra's weathered fingers found the silver locket hanging beneath his shirt, a habit that had become unconscious over the years. Inside lay a miniature portrait of Margaret Sinclair, her gentle smile captured forever in delicate brushstrokes. Her name was Margaret, Ezra began, his voice carrying the weight of old grief. Met her in Nassau of all places. She was the governor's niece, visiting from England, beautiful as morning light on calm water, with a mind sharp enough to match any scholar. The memory came flooding back. Margaret in her blue silk dress, standing on the harbor balcony as evening painted the sky in shades of coral and gold. She'd been sketching the sunset when Ezra first saw her, completely absorbed in capturing beauty on paper. I was different then, Ezra continued, trimming the mainsail. Younger, certainly, more reckless. Thought I was invincible with my loyal crew and fast ship. Margaret saw through all that bluster to something worth loving. Crimson preened his wing feathers. Love makes fools of the wisest men and sages of the greatest fools. Mackenzie's words, ancient wisdom, Mackenzie just understood it better than most. The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of distant rain. Ezra adjusted course instinctively, his body responding to decades of reading weather signs. Margaret had loved watching him sail, marveling at how he seemed to dance with wind and wave. We were going to be married, Ezra said, his voice barely audible above the sound of water against the hull. I'd saved enough to buy land in Barbados, maybe start a plantation. Respectable life for a reformed pirate and the woman who tamed him. Crimson remained silent, sensing the darkness approaching in the tale. That's when Captain Rodrigo Vega, Ezra's knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel. Portuguese pirate with a reputation for taking whatever he wanted. He'd heard about the English Rose who'd captured Blackwood's heart. The attack had come at dawn, swift and merciless. Vega's ship, the Blood Tide, had cornered the Siren's Revenge in a narrow channel between 2 small islands. Ezra's crew had fought bravely, but Vega had brought superior numbers and fresh men hungry for plunder. I had a choice, Ezra continued, his voice hollow with remembered anguish. Fight and watch my crew die, or surrender Margaret and sail away. Vega promised he'd release her unharmed after. He couldn't finish the sentence. But you fought anyway, Crimson said gently. Of course I fought. But while I was engaged in single combat with Vega, his men took her. Ezra's hand found the locket again. By the time I realized what was happening, the Blood Tide was disappearing over the horizon. Margaret was screaming my name. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the eternal conversation between wind and sail. Ezra had never told the complete story to anyone, but something about Crimson's steady presence made confession feel natural. "I tracked them for 3 months," Ezra said finally. "When I finally caught up, Vega's ship was a burned wreck on a beach in Cuba. Spanish Navy had gotten there first, found evidence of a fight, but no survivors. Margaret's body was never recovered. And your crew," Ezra's laugh held no humor, "started losing faith after that. Said I was cursed, that my obsession with revenge would doom us all. Torres was the only one who stayed loyal, or so I thought. He encouraged the hunt for Vega's remaining allies, promised we'd make them all pay. Until 6 months ago, Ezra agreed. Woke up to find them gone. Torres left a note saying they'd followed me long enough into darkness. Said I wasn't the captain they'd sworn allegiance to anymore." Crimson suddenly grew agitated, squawking and flapping his wings. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the parrot's behavior suggested this was no ordinary storm. "Shelter," Crimson screeched. "Hidden Cove, 2 points starboard. Mackenzie used it during hurricane season." The Hidden Cove, Crimson had guided them to, proved more than adequate shelter from the brewing storm. Tall cliffs rose on 3 sides, their faces carved with centuries of wind and rain into shapes that resembled ancient guardians watching over the protected water. As the Siren's Revenge dropped anchor, Ezra marveled at how perfectly concealed the entrance was from the open sea. Mackenzie discovered this place during the hurricane of 1698. Crimson explained, settling on his favorite perch near the compass. Storm lasted 6 days. By the time it passed, he'd mapped every cave and inlet. But it was the second ship that captured Ezra's attention. Half submerged near the far shore sat the skeletal remains of once proud vessel. Her masts had long since fallen, and barnacles covered her hull like armor. But the distinctive figurehead, a mermaid clutching a trident, marked her unmistakably. "The Kraken's daughter," Ezra breathed. "That's Iron Mackenzie's ship." Crimson's feathers ruffled with what appeared to be old grief. "She ran aground here 5 years ago. Mackenzie was already dying from Torres's blade, but he managed to beach her in this cove before the end." As soon as the Siren's Revenge was secure, Ezra lowered a small boat and rowed toward the wreck with Crimson perched on his shoulder. The parrot grew increasingly agitated as they approached, muttering phrases in voices that didn't belong to him. "The logbook," Crimson said urgently. "Third drawer, captain's cabin." Mackenzie hid it behind the false panel. The cabin had been partially flooded, but the sealed drawer had protected its contents from the worst of the water damage. Ezra's hands trembled as he pulled out a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed, but still readable. Mackenzie's bold handwriting filled every page with observations, charts, and increasingly cryptic entries. "Listen to this," Ezra said, reading aloud by lantern light. "Day 8047 at sea. The bird speaks truths I dare not write plainly. Serpent's Eye Island holds more than treasure. It holds the weight of choices that echo through generations." Crimson bobbed his head. Mackenzie understood that some secrets are too dangerous for ordinary minds. He wrote in riddles to protect future seekers from their own greed. Page after page revealed Mackenzie's growing obsession with something he called the Three Moon Treasure. References appeared to weather patterns, ancient symbols, and warnings about those who seek gold but find only shadow. "Here," Ezra said, finding a particularly intriguing passage. "Day 903-3, Crimson recites the old songs tonight. The memory birds remember what we choose to forget. If I fall to treachery, he carries forward what must not be lost. The guardian's price is steep, but some wisdom is worth any sacrifice." "Memory birds?" Ezra looked at his companion with new understanding. "You're not just any parrot, are you?" Crimson's eyes held depths that seemed far older than any creature should possess. "My kind has served worthy captains for centuries. We remember their wisdom, their mistakes, their discoveries. Mackenzie was the 7th captain I served. Each taught me something vital about leadership and sacrifice." The implications staggered Ezra. If Crimson truly possessed the accumulated knowledge of 7 legendary pirate captains, then his value exceeded any treasure chest full of gold. What happened to the others? Ezra asked quietly. Some died in battle, others succumbed to age or disease. Captain Thornfield chose to retire to a small island where he taught children to read. Each left their mark on history, and their wisdom lives on through me. Thunder rumbled overhead as the storm reached its full fury. Rain hammered the cove's surface, while Ezra continued reading Mackenzie's final entries. The last few pages grew increasingly urgent, filled with warnings about Torres and references to a map hidden where only the true of heart can find it. Torres knew about your abilities, Ezra realized. That's why he betrayed Mackenzie. He wanted to claim you and the knowledge you carry. Torres understands power but not wisdom, Crimson replied. He believes that owning me would make him the greatest pirate who ever lived. He cannot comprehend that such knowledge must be earned through sacrifice and proven through action. A distant flash of lightning illuminated something carved into the cabin's far wall, symbols that matched those described in Mackenzie's logbook. Ezra approached the wall and discovered that the symbols formed a crude map with Serpent's Eye Island marked prominently at the center. "This is it," Ezra whispered. "The location Mackenzie died protecting." Crimson studied the carved map with intense concentration. "The symbols tell a story. They speak of tests that must be faced, trials that separate the worthy from the merely ambitious. Serpent's Eye Island chooses who may claim its secrets." Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, but Ezra barely noticed. His mind raced with possibilities and dangers. If Torres truly was hunting them, then possessing Mackenzie's final clues would make them even more valuable targets. But for the first time since his crew's betrayal, Ezra felt the stirrings of genuine purpose. This quest represented more than revenge or treasure. It was a chance to prove himself worthy of the trust both Mackenzie and Crimson had placed in him. The storm that struck 3 days later came without warning, as if the very sea had turned against them. Ezra had seen hurricanes before, but this tempest carried an otherworldly fury that made his bones ache and his compass spin wildly. The Siren's Revenge pitched and rolled like a toy in a child's bath, her timbers groaning under the assault of waves tall as cathedral spires. Hard to port, Ezra shouted over the howling wind, fighting to keep the wheels steady as another massive wave crashed over the bow. But it was Crimson who saved them. The parrot had taken position near the mainmast, his feathers plastered against his body by the driving rain, yet his voice cut through the storm with uncanny clarity. "Reef ahead, starboard side, rocky shoals in 30 yards, Crimson screeched, somehow seeing through the wall of water and darkness that blinded human eyes. Ezra spun the wheel hard, trusting the bird's guidance completely. The ship groaned in protest, but responded, sliding past jagged rocks that would have torn her hull apart. Again and again, Crimson's warnings steered them away from death, his supernatural senses reading dangers that no mortal could detect. When the storm finally began to weaken, they found themselves in the shallows of a small, uncharted island. Exhausted and battered, Ezra beached the ship on a stretch of white sand and collapsed against the wheel, his chest heaving. "How?" he gasped, looking at Crimson with new amazement. "How did you see through that storm?" Crimson preened his bedraggled feathers with dignified calm. "Memory birds see more than the present moment, Captain. We perceive the patterns that connect past, present, and future." Mackenzie called it reading the ocean's memory. As dawn broke over their temporary refuge, Ezra explored the small island while Crimson rode on his shoulder. The place felt ancient, untouched by human presence except for scattered driftwood and shells. But near the island's center, half buried in sand, Ezra discovered something that made his breath catch. A crystal navigation stone, perfectly spherical and clear as mountain water, lay nestled among the roots of a gnarled palm tree. The moment Ezra lifted it, the crystal began to glow with soft blue light, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Ordinary," Crimson whispered, his voice filled with reverence. "I've heard legends of such stones, but never seen one." They're said to be remnants of the first navigators, created when the world was young. The crystal's glow intensified whenever Crimson drew near, and strangest of all, it seemed to resonate with the parrot's voice. When Crimson spoke, ripples of light danced through the stone's interior, like captured lightning. "There's more," Crimson said, his voice taking on an odd, musical quality that Ezra had never heard before. "This island, it's not natural. It was raised from the seafloor by ancient powers, placed here as a way station for those who would seek the deepest treasures." As if summoned by the parrot's words, memories that weren't Ezra's own began flowing through his mind. He saw flashes of other captains standing on this very beach, men and women whose names had become legend, each carrying their own crystal stone, each guided by their own memory bird. "The song," Crimson began, his voice shifting into an ancient melody that seemed to come from the stone itself. "When 3 moons dance in silver light, and crystal shows the hidden way, the bird who holds the keeper's sight shall guide the worthy through the fray." The words resonated in Ezra's bones, awakening something he'd never known existed within him. The crystal in his hands grew warm, and he understood with startling clarity that their meeting in the Port Royal market had been no accident. "You've been searching for me," he said, not asking but stating a truth that felt absolute. "Not just any captain, but specifically me." Crimson's dark eyes held infinite sadness and infinite hope. "For 7 years since Mackenzie's death, I've watched and waited. The crystal calls to those with the potential to become what their world needs most. You felt its pull without knowing why. It's what led you to the market that day, what made you look past the crowd to see a forgotten bird in a rusty cage." A chill ran down Ezra's spine that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. "What am I supposed to become?" Before Crimson could answer, a distant sail appeared on the horizon. Even at this distance, Ezra recognized the distinctive black and red design Torres had found them. "He's been tracking us," Crimson said grimly. "The crystal's awakening sends ripples through the spiritual realm. Those who seek power for its own sake can sense such disturbances." Ezra pocketed the crystal and ran toward his beached ship. The Siren's revenge would need time to refloat with the tide, time they might not have if Torres reached them first. "Can we escape?" Ezra asked, frantically checking his ship's condition. Crimson's feathers ruffled with determination. "Not escape, Captain. Face what comes. The crystal has chosen you, but that choice must be proven. Torres brings the first test." Torres arrived with the evening tide, his ship, the Devil's Bargain, cutting through the waves like a blade seeking flesh. Ezra watched from behind a cluster of palm trees as his former first mate stepped onto the beach, followed by 8 heavily armed men. The years had hardened Torres. His once jovial face now bore the cruel lines of a man who had traded friendship for ambition. As Torres called across the sand, his voice carrying the false warmth of old camaraderie. "Come out, old friend. We need to talk." Crimson pressed close to Ezra's shoulder, whispering urgently. "He carries Mackenzie's cutlass, the silver blade with the serpent hilt. Torres took it as a trophy after the murder." Indeed, the distinctive weapon hung at Torres' side, its polished surface catching the last rays of sunlight. Ezra's hand instinctively moved to his own sword, remembering countless times he and Torres had fought side by side, trusting each other with their lives. "I know you're here," Torres continued, his men spreading out in a practiced formation. "That bird of yours has quite a reputation. Amazing what men will pay to learn the secrets it carries." Ezra stepped into view, keeping his hands visible but ready. "Hello, Miguel. Still collecting trophies from dead friends, I see." Torres smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Mackenzie was never my friend, just a stepping stone to greater things, much like our partnership was for you. I treated you like a brother, you treated me like a useful fool." Torres spat, his facade dropping. 20 years I followed you, watched you make decisions that cost good men their lives. All for what? Some English rose who was too good for a pirate's bed." The words hit Ezra like physical blows. Margaret's memory was sacred ground, not to be trodden on by this betrayer's boots. "Leave her out of this," Ezra growled, his hand moving to his sword hilt. Why should I? Your obsession with that dead woman destroyed our crew's morale long before I acted. The men needed a leader who lived in the present, not one haunted by ghosts. Torres drew Mackenzie's silver cutlass, the serpent design seeming to writhe in the fading light. Give me the bird, Ezra. I know what it carries, the combined knowledge of 7 legendary captains. With that wisdom I can become the most powerful pirate who ever sailed. Crimson ruffled his feathers defiantly. Power without wisdom is destruction, Torres. Mackenzie learned that truth too late. Shut up, bird, Torres snapped. You'll sing a different tune when you're in my cage. The confrontation erupted without further warning. Torres lunged forward with Mackenzie's blade while his men closed in from multiple angles, but Ezra had spent 6 months alone, and solitude had sharpened his reflexes to razor keenness. Steel rang against steel as Ezra parried Torres' opening thrust, the sound echoing across the beach like a bell tolling death. The 2 men circled each other, 20 years of shared history adding weight to every strike and counterstrike. You always were too sentimental, Torres panted, pressing his attack. That's why you'll lose everything again. But Crimson had not remained idle. The parrot launched himself from Ezra's shoulder directly at the nearest attacker's face, his talons and beak creating havoc. Behind you, starboard, he screeched, warning Ezra of an approaching threat. Ezra spun and caught a second attacker's blade on his crossguard, then drove his pommel into the man's face. The crystal in his pocket pulsed with warmth, and somehow he found himself moving with fluidity and precision that surprised even him. The boat, Crimson, cried, having spotted their escape route, tides turning, fighting a running battle toward the water's edge. Ezra managed to reach the Siren's Revenge as she began to lift with the incoming tide. Torres and his remaining men splashed through the shallows in pursuit, their leader's face twisted with frustrated rage. This isn't over, Blackwood, Torres shouted as Ezra hauled himself over the rail. I know where you're heading. Serpent's Eye Island won't protect you. As the Siren's Revenge caught wind and pulled away from the beach, Ezra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean spray. Torres knowing about Serpent's Eye Island meant this pursuit had been planned long before their chance encounter. He killed Mackenzie for information, Crimson said grimly, settling on his perch as they gained speed. But Mackenzie only told him half-truths. Torres thinks the island holds traditional treasure, gold and jewels to be claimed by force. And what does it really hold? Crimson's dark eyes reflected the stars beginning to appear overhead. Tests that reveal who a man truly is beneath all his pretenses. Torres will follow us there, but the island will judge him by his own standards. Ezra checked their heading and adjusted the sails for maximum speed. Behind them, the Devil's Bargain was already launching in pursuit, her crew driven by their captain's desperate ambition. The race to Serpent's Eye Island had begun. 2 days of hard sailing brought them to Tortuga, where the familiar chaos of the pirate haven provided perfect cover from pursuing eyes. The Devil's Bargain had maintained distance throughout their flight, close enough to track, but far enough to avoid another confrontation. Torres was clearly planning something more elaborate than a simple ship-to-ship battle. Ezra moored the Siren's Revenge at a discreet wharf and made his way through crowded streets that reeked of rum, salt and desperation. Crimson rode hidden beneath his coat, only his bright eyes visible in the shadowed interior. Mama Rosa's tavern squatted like a comfortable toad at the intersection of 3 narrow alleys, its weathered sign creaking in the sea breeze. Inside, smoke from countless pipes created a perpetual haze that softened harsh faces and muffled dangerous conversations. Rosa herself held court behind the bar, a woman of indeterminate age, whose kind eyes belied a reputation for knowing every secret worth knowing in the Caribbean. Ezra Blackwood, she said warmly as he approached, her Spanish accent making his name sound like music. Been wondering when you'd darken my doorway again. Heard your crew finally came to their senses. News travels fast, Ezra said, settling onto a bar stool and accepting the rum she poured without being asked. Fast enough to know you're not sailing alone anymore. Her dark eyes flickered meaningfully toward his coat. Some passengers are worth more than gold, yeah? Crimson emerged from hiding, causing several nearby patrons to pause their conversations. Word of the memory bird had spread through pirate circles like wildfire, though most dismissed such tales as tavern fantasy. Dios mio, Rosa whispered, crossing herself. It's true then, you carry one of the ancient ones. You know about memory birds? Ezra asked. Captain, one of his men whispered nervously. Perhaps we should Torres, backhanded the speaker without looking away from the mirror. Silence. I know what I am, and I don't need some magical glass to tell me otherwise. That was when Ezra, Diego, and Crimson entered the chamber. The temple's acoustics carried their footsteps like thunder, causing Torres to spin around with wild eyes and raised blade. Ezra, Torres, snarled, come to witness my moment of triumph. I've come to stop you from desecrating something you can't understand. Ezra replied, drawing his own sword with careful deliberation. The mirror of intentions began showing new reflections as the two groups faced each other. Ezra's image revealed a man haunted by loss, but driven by genuine desire to protect others from suffering similar pain. Diego appeared as someone seeking justice rather than revenge, his grandfather's moral teachings still guiding his choices. Despite years of hardship, look at yourself, Miguel, Ezra said, gesturing toward Torres' reflection. Is that really who you want to be remembered as? Torres glanced at his image and saw a hollow man surrounded by the ghosts of everyone he had betrayed or murdered. Mackenzie's spirit stood prominently among them, along with Diego's brother and Sarah's sister, all staring at him with eyes that held more pity than anger. I am what this world made me, Torres spat. The weak deserve whatever happens to them. The Crimson spoke with voices from the past, Mackenzie, Elena Vasquez, and others who had known true strength. You mistake cruelty for power, Miguel Torres. True strength lifts others up rather than tearing them down. Torres lunged forward with a battle cry that echoed through the temple like a wounded animal's scream. His remaining men hesitated, unnerved by their reflections showing them as cowards and murderers rather than brave pirates. The battle that erupted in the mirror chamber was unlike any Ezra had ever fought. Each sword stroke was reflected and amplified by the temple's magic, showing not just the physical confrontation, but the spiritual war between different philosophies of leadership and life. Diego engaged one of Torres' men with the fluid grace his grandfather had taught him, treating combat as a dance rather than butchery. His reflection showed a protector of the innocent, someone fighting for justice rather than personal gain. Torres himself fought with desperate fury, but his anger made him sloppy. Years of easy victories against weaker opponents had left him unprepared for a battle against someone who fought with both skill and righteous purpose. You always were too sentimental, Torres panted, as their blades locked. That's why Margaret died, because you cared more about honor than winning. The words were designed to wound, but the mirror of intentions showed Ezra something profound. His love for Margaret hadn't been weakness, it had been the source of every good thing he'd accomplished since. Her memory had kept him from becoming another Torres, motivated him to protect others from experiencing similar loss. She didn't die because I was weak, Ezra replied, breaking the blade lock and stepping back. She died because men like you exist in this world. But her death taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even when victory seems impossible. Torres' next attack came with renewed fury, but also renewed desperation. The mirror was showing him visions of his future, a lonely death surrounded by enemies, his name spoken only as a cautionary tale about the price of betrayal. Behind them, Crimson had begun speaking in an ancient language that made the temple stones resonate with power. The words seemed to awaken something fundamental in the mountain's structure, causing the mirrors to glow brighter and the air itself to thicken with supernatural energy. The mountain is awakening, Diego called out, parrying a thrust from his opponent. Whatever's going to happen here, it needs to happen soon. The mirror of intentions began showing one final vision, not of the past or present, but of potential futures that hung in the balance of this moment's outcome. In some reflections, Torres succeeded and became a tyrant who brought suffering to thousands. In others, Ezra emerged victorious and used the island's wisdom to build something better. The temple's vibrations reached a crescendo as ancient mechanisms activated throughout the mountain. Stone guardians that had stood motionless for centuries began turning their heads, their eyes glowing with the same ethereal light that emanated from the mirrors. The very air seemed alive with power that had been accumulating for generations. In the midst of battle, Crimson's voice suddenly changed, taking on harmonics that no earthly bird could produce. "Ezra Blackwood," he called out in tones that seemed to come from the mountain itself. "The time of revelation has come. You must choose. Will you accept the true burden of the memory bird's bond?" Ezra parried Torres' latest attack while trying to understand what was happening around them. The crystal in his pocket had grown so hot it nearly burned through the fabric, and the mirrors were showing visions that extended far beyond the present moment. "What burden?" Ezra called back, driving Torres away with a series of precise strikes. "To become the keeper of all our accumulated wisdom," Crimson replied, his form beginning to glow with the same light as the temple stones. "To accept that true leadership means serving others rather than ruling them. To understand that a captain's greatest treasure is the crew who willingly follows him into danger." Torres sneered even as sweat streamed down his face from their prolonged duel. "More sentimental nonsense. Power is what matters, the ability to take what you want and crush anyone who opposes you." That's when the temple revealed its ultimate secret. The crown of feathers materialized above Crimson's head. A circlet of pure light that bore the accumulated memories of every memory bird who had ever served a worthy captain. The artifact was beautiful beyond description, but its weight of responsibility was visible even from a distance. 7 centuries of wisdom," Crimson announced, his voice now carrying the harmonized tones of all his previous bonds. 7 generations of captains who learned that true strength comes from unity, not domination. "Miguel Torres, this knowledge could be yours, but only if you can prove yourself worthy of such trust." Torres stopped fighting and stared at the crown with naked hunger. Here was power beyond his wildest dreams. The combined knowledge of legendary pirates, their strategies, their secret routes, their hidden treasures. With such wisdom he could indeed become the most feared captain who ever sailed. "Give it to me," he demanded, lowering his sword. "I've earned it through strength and cunning." The crown of feathers pulsed with gentle light, then showed Torres exactly what accepting such responsibility would mean. The visions that flooded his mind revealed the price of true leadership: sleepless nights worrying about crew members' safety, difficult decisions that prioritized others' welfare over personal gain, the constant burden of earning loyalty rather than commanding it through fear. Torres' face contorted with disgust as he witnessed captains who had sacrificed their own comfort for their men's well-being, who had shared treasure equally rather than keeping the largest portion, who had risked their own lives to save crew members during battles. "That's not leadership," he spat. "That's slavery to the weak and worthless." The temple's response was immediate and absolute. The stone guardians stepped down from their pedestals with grinding sounds that shook dust from the ceiling. Their eyes blazed with righteous fury as they advanced on Torres and his surviving men. "The unworthy have condemned themselves," Crimson announced sadly. "They cannot be allowed to leave with knowledge they would use to harm innocent people." But Ezra surprised everyone by stepping between Torres and the approaching guardians. "Wait," he commanded, and amazingly the stone figures halted their advance. "Miguel," Ezra said, turning to face his former friend, "you still have a choice. The man I once called brother is still in there somewhere. You can change, become someone worthy of redemption." Torres' laugh held no humor, only bitter acknowledgement of defeat. "You never understood, did you, Ezra? Some people are born to serve, and others are born to rule. I'd rather die as a free man than live as someone else's conscience." With those words, Torres raised Mackenzie's stolen cutlass and charged not at Ezra, but directly at the crown of feathers, intent on destroying what he couldn't possess. The temple's reaction was swift and merciless. Lightning erupted from the crown, striking Torres mid-stride and sending him crashing into the mirror wall. The impact shattered his reflection into 1,000 fragments, each piece showing a different moment of betrayal from his past. His surviving men, seeing their captain defeated by powers they couldn't comprehend, threw down their weapons and fled toward the temple entrance. The stone guardians allowed them to pass, understanding that these followers had been more misguided than truly evil. As the echoes of Torres's final scream faded, the crown of feathers settled gently onto Crimson's head. The parrot's transformation was immediate and profound. His feathers took on an iridescent quality that seemed to contain entire galaxies, and his eyes became pools of ancient wisdom. "It is done," Crimson said, his voice now carrying the authority of centuries. "The bond is offered. Ezra Blackwood, will you accept the responsibility of becoming a Memory Bird's chosen captain?" The weight of Crimson's question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that Ezra was only beginning to understand. Around them the temple had fallen silent except for the gentle humming of the crown of feathers and the distant sound of Torres' fleeing men scrambling through the passages toward the outside world. Diego stood nearby, his sword still drawn but forgotten as he witnessed something that existed beyond the realm of ordinary human experience. The navigator's practical mind struggled to process what he'd seen: ancient magic, stone guardians coming to life, and now this offer of a bond that would fundamentally change his captain's nature. "Tell me what it means," Ezra said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "All of it. No more riddles or partial truths." Crimson's transformed appearance made him seem less like a bird and more like a living embodiment of the sea's eternal wisdom. When he spoke, his voice carried echoes of every captain who had ever accepted this responsibility. "The binding ceremony creates a connection deeper than friendship, stronger than blood," Crimson explained. "Your consciousness and mine become intertwined, allowing you to access the memories and wisdom of 7 legendary captains spanning 3 centuries. You would see through their eyes, learn from their mistakes, draw upon their accumulated knowledge of leadership, navigation, combat, and statecraft. And the price: your mortal lifespan is cut to perhaps 20 years. The bond burns bright but brief. The human mind and body cannot contain such vast knowledge for a normal lifetime. Every previous captain who underwent the ceremony died young, though each left a legacy that echoed through the ages. Diego stepped forward, concern etched on his weathered features. "Captain, surely there's another way. We don't need magic to fight injustice or protect the innocent." But even as he spoke, Diego's eyes were drawn to an alcove behind the main mirror, where additional artifacts had been revealed. A chalice of impossible beauty sat upon a pedestal of black stone, its surface covered with the same symbols they'd seen throughout the temple. The binding ceremony chalice, the vessel through which the connection between bird and captain would be forged. "The choice must be freely made," Crimson continued, "and it must be made for the right reasons. Those who seek the bond for personal power find only death. Those who accept it to serve something greater than themselves become legends that inspire generations." Ezra thought of Margaret, of the promise he'd made to her memory to become someone worthy of her love. He thought of his new crew, Sarah, old Pete, Diego, who had trusted him enough to follow him into mortal danger. He thought of all the innocent people who suffered under tyrants like Torres, and of the good he could accomplish with the wisdom of ages at his disposal. "There's something else," Crimson said softly. "The bond is permanent until death. Once accepted, it cannot be undone. You would never again be free to live solely for yourself. Every decision, every action would carry the weight of responsibility to preserve and expand the legacy of wisdom we protect." The temple's mirrors showed Ezra visions of possible future. In some, he accepted the bond and became a captain whose name was spoken with the same reverence as the legends of old. His crew grew into a force for justice throughout the Caribbean, protecting merchant ships from pirates, rescuing slaves from brutal masters, and standing against corrupt governors who oppressed the common people. In other reflections, he declined the bond and lived a long, ordinary life. He aged gracefully, perhaps found love again, watched grandchildren play in gardens he would plant. It was a peaceful future, but one where his potential to change the world remained unfulfilled. The captains who came before, Ezra asked, do you still carry their personalities, their individual voices? Everyone, Crimson replied. Captain Elena Vasquez still argues for compassion in leadership. Captain Thornfield advocates for protecting the innocent. Captain Mackenzie counsels patience and strategic thinking. They live on through me and through any captain worthy enough to join their council. The implications staggered Ezra. He wouldn't just be gaining knowledge, he'd be joining a brotherhood of legendary leaders whose wisdom could guide him through any crisis. But he'd also be accepting that his own life would be measured not in years, but in the positive changes he could accomplish before the bond's intensity consumed his mortal frame. Diego had moved to examine the chalice more closely, his navigator's instincts drawn to its mysterious construction. The craftsmanship is beyond anything I've ever seen. This wasn't made by human hands. It was forged by the same ancient powers that created the memory birds. Crimson explained. A focusing lens for consciousness, allowing two minds to merge while maintaining their individual identities. As Ezra contemplated his decision, he realized that the choice had already been made the moment he looked into Crimson's cage back at the Port Royal Market. Everything since then had been leading to this moment. The storms weathered, the crew assembled, the bonds of trust forged through shared danger. If I accept, he said finally, what happens to the others? To Sarah and old Pete back at the ship. They become part of something larger than any of us imagined. A crew chosen not by accident but by destiny, each member possessing qualities essential for the work ahead. The temple began to tremble as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting for Ezra's decision. Ancient mechanisms groaned beneath the stone floor, and the mirrors flickered with images of every great captain who had ever stood at this crossroads. Each reflection showed a moment of choice, a turning point where ordinary men had stepped forward to accept extraordinary responsibility. But it was the appearance of the scales of justice that truly conveyed the magnitude of what was being offered. The artifact materialized from thin air beside the chalice, a perfect balance of crystalline beauty and practical function. One side held a single feather from Crimson's crown, glowing with accumulated wisdom. The other side waited empty, ready to weigh whatever Ezra would place there. The final test, Crimson announced, his voice carrying reverence for ancient tradition. Your heart must be weighed against the feather of wisdom. If it balances true, the bond may be forged. If not, Diego stepped closer, studying the scales with the eyes of someone who had spent his life measuring wind and tide, calculating the forces that governed ships and destiny. What happens if the heart proves too heavy with selfish desires, or too light with lack of conviction? Then the mountain rejects the candidate. Crimson replied simply. The temple closes, the artifacts disappear, and the seeker is returned to the harbor with no memory of what transpired here. It's happened before, 3 times in the past century, good men who simply weren't ready for such responsibility. Suddenly the sound of running footsteps echoed through the temple corridors. Sarah's voice carried from the passage entrance, sharp with urgency and concern. Captain Diego, we've got problems. She burst into the chamber with old Pete close behind, both of them breathing hard from their desperate run through the jungle. Sarah's clothes were torn and bloodied from fighting through the island's defensive barriers, and old Pete's usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by grim determination. Tora's remaining men reached the harbor, Sarah reported between gasps. They've taken the devil's bargain and are trying to destroy our ship before we can escape. Figured if they can't have the treasure, they'll make sure we can't leave with it either. Old Pete nodded grimly. Bastards set fire to our mainsail and cut most of our rigging. We drove them off with cannon fire, but the damage is serious. Without repairs, we'll never make it past the reefs. The interruption forced Ezra to confront the immediate reality beyond the temple's mystical atmosphere. His crew needed him. not as some legendary figure weighted down with ancient wisdom, but as the captain who could get them safely home. The scales seemed to pulse with understanding, as if testing his priorities in real time. "How long do we have?" Ezra asked, his hand moving instinctively to the crystal in his pocket. "Maybe 3 hours before the tide turns enough for us to attempt the passage," Sarah replied, "but that's only if we can jury-rig enough sail and rigging to make the ship seaworthy." Diego looked between the mystical artifacts and his captain's face, reading the conflict there. "The ceremony can wait, can't it? We could return once the ship is safe." But Crimson shook his head sadly. "The temple's awakening follows celestial patterns that align only once every 7 years. Miss this opportunity, and it won't come again until you're too old to survive the bomb's intensity." The weight of simultaneous responsibilities pressed down on Ezra like the ocean depths. His crew needed their captain to lead them to safety. The memory bird and all the wisdom he represented required a decision that couldn't be delayed. Taurus surviving men were actively working to trap them on the island, and time was running out in multiple directions. That's when he understood the true nature of the test. The scales of justice weren't weighing his past actions or future intentions. They were measuring his ability to balance competing responsibilities in the present. A captain worthy of the bond would find a way to serve both his immediate crew and the larger cause of justice. "Sarah," he said, decision crystallizing in his voice, "take old Pete and get back to the ship. Begin repairs immediately. Focus on making her minimally seaworthy, not perfect. What about you and Diego? We'll complete what we came here to do, then join you at the harbor. If the temple's timing is as precise as Crimson says, the ceremony shouldn't take long." Sarah started to protest, but something in Ezra's demeanor stopped her. She'd sailed with enough captains to recognize when a man had found his true course, regardless of the storms ahead. "Aye, Captain," she said simply. "We'll be ready." As Sarah and old Pete disappeared back into the temple corridors, Ezra approached the scales of justice with newfound resolve. The artifacts seemed to respond to his presence, the feather glowing brighter, as if anticipating what was to come. "I accept," he said, placing his hand over his heart. "Not for power or glory, but because some responsibilities can't be avoided by good men in dark times." The scales began to glow with their own inner light, ready to weigh the sincerity of his commitment. The moment Ezra placed his hand over his heart, the scales of justice began their ancient work. But instead of simply measuring his current intentions, the artifacts delved deeper, extracting the very essence of who he had become through decades of choices, both noble and flawed. Images flowed across the temple's mirrors as his heart's true weight was revealed. They saw Margaret's death and his years of bitter pursuit of revenge, but also the moment he'd chosen to spare the life of one of Vega's crew members who had begged for mercy. They witnessed his crew's abandonment, but also the countless times he had risked his own safety to protect those who served under him. "The scales reveal more than worthiness," Crimson explained as the crystalline balance began to glow. "They show the accumulated weight of every choice that shaped your character. Love carries weight, so does loss. Mercy balances cruelty, sacrifice outweighs selfishness." Diego watched in fascination as ethereal representations of Ezra's deeds appeared on the scale opposite the wisdom feather. Each act of kindness seemed to add light rather than weight, while moments of selfishness created shadows that threatened to tip the balance toward failure. But it was what happened next that surprised everyone present. As the scales approached perfect equilibrium, a new element entered the equation. The simple ring that had been Ezra's only physical connection to his crew's loyalty. The captain's oath ring, worn smooth by years of wear, suddenly materialized on the scales beside his heart's weight. The ring carried its own accumulated meaning, every promise made to crew members, every oath of protection sworn over shared meals and dangerous watches. It represented the bonds between leader and follower that transcended mere employment or fear. The kind of relationship that made men willing to follow their captain into death itself. "Extraordinary," Crimson whispered. "The ring carries the spiritual weight of every oath you've honored, every promise kept even when breaking it would have been easier." The scales achieved perfect balance, neither wisdom nor heart proving heavier than the other. The temple responded with a harmonious chime that seemed to resonate from the mountain's very core, and the binding ceremony chalice began filling with liquid starlight. "It is time," Crimson announced, but his voice carried both joy and sorrow. "Once we drink from the chalice together, we will be bound until death parts us. Your choices become mine, and mine become yours. Are you prepared for such intimacy of spirit?" Ezra looked at Diego, seeing both pride and concern in his navigator's weathered features. "Whatever happens here, I want you to know you and Sarah and old Pete have already given me something more valuable than any treasure. You've shown me that trust can be rebuilt, that good crews can be found even after the worst betrayals." Diego nodded, understanding that he was witnessing a moment that would echo through history. "We'll be waiting at the harbor, Captain, however long this takes." But before the ceremony could proceed, the temple's entrance passages filled with the sound of armed men moving with military precision. Torres' remaining crew hadn't fled. They'd returned with reinforcements, including several Spanish Marines, whose presence suggested official backing for their mission. "Surround the temple," a voice commanded in accented English. "Captain Hernandez wants them taken alive if possible, but don't let them escape with whatever they came to steal." Crimson's feathers ruffled with alarm. Captain Luis Hernandez. Torres had arrangements with corrupt Spanish officials. They must have been tracking our movements since we left Tortuga. The situation had become impossibly complex. Outside, professional soldiers were closing in with orders to capture or kill them. At the harbor, Sarah and old Pete were fighting to repair their only means of escape. And here in the temple's heart, the opportunity for the binding ceremony was rapidly disappearing as immediate survival took precedence. "The chalice," Ezra said urgently. "Can the ceremony be completed quickly?" "Not properly," Crimson replied. "The bond requires ritual precision that can't be rushed without risking both our lives. But there is another way, an emergency bonding that creates a temporary connection lasting only hours instead of decades." "What would that accomplish?" "It would give you access to my memories and the wisdom of previous captains for long enough to escape this trap. But afterward, the opportunity for a permanent bond would be lost forever. The ancient laws require a complete ceremony or none at all." Diego had moved to the temple entrance, listening to the approaching soldiers' movements with the tactical awareness of a man who had survived countless battles. "They're spreading out to cover all possible exits. Professional work. These aren't ordinary pirates or treasure hunters." The weight of decision pressed down on Ezra once again, but this time the stakes were even higher. He could accept the temporary bond and save his crew, but lose forever the chance to become something greater. Or he could attempt the full ceremony and risk everyone dying before it could be completed. "How long for the complete binding?" he asked. 20 minutes at minimum," Crimson replied. "And it requires absolute concentration. Any interruption could prove fatal to both of us." The sound of boots on stone grew closer, accompanied by the metallic ringing of weapons being prepared for battle. The decision crystallized in Ezra's mind with the clarity that only comes in moments of absolute crisis. His crew's safety mattered more than personal destiny, but perhaps there was a third option that neither he nor Crimson had considered. "The emergency bond," he said firmly. "But not just for escape, to prove that we're worthy of something greater." Before Crimson could question this cryptic statement, Ezra grasped the chalice and drank deeply of the liquid starlight. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. 7 lifetimes of memories crashed into his consciousness like a tidal wave, threatening to drown his individual identity in the accumulated experiences of legendary captains. Crimson drank from the same vessel, and suddenly their minds were linked in ways that transcended normal understanding. Ezra could feel the parrot's ancient wisdom flowing through him, while Crimson experienced human emotions and physical sensations as if they were his own. But the true revelation came when their combined consciousness reached out and touched something unexpected: the spiritual presence of his crew. Sarah, old Pete, and Diego weren't just employees or followers. They were extensions of his own will and purpose, connected by bonds deeper than formal hierarchy. "Now I understand," Ezra whispered, his voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there moments before. The bond isn't between one captain and one bird. It's between a memory bird and the entire crew that proves itself worthy of such trust. To the temple's mirrors began showing the truth of this realization. Sarah, fighting desperately to repair their ship while outnumbered by hostile forces. Old Pete, using his knowledge of ship's construction to jury-rig solutions that shouldn't have worked but did anyway. Diego calculating wind and tide with supernatural precision born of genuine love for the sea itself. Each of them carried a piece of what made a legendary captain: Sarah's unwavering courage, Diego's navigational genius, Old Pete's ability to maintain morale through the darkest storms. Together they formed something greater than the sum of their individual talents. The Spanish Marines burst into the temple chamber with professional efficiency, their muskets trained on the two figures standing beside the mystical artifacts. Captain Hernandez followed close behind, a career military officer whose crisp uniform and calculating eyes marked him as far more dangerous than Torres had ever been. "Step away from the bird," Hernandez commanded in accented but precise English. "His Catholic Majesty has great interest in creatures rumored to possess such unusual knowledge." Ezra turned to face the soldiers with movements that seemed to flow like water over stone. The temporary bond had changed him in ways that were immediately visible. His eyes held depth that spoke of vast experience, and his posture carried the confident authority of someone who had faced death countless times and emerged victorious. "Captain Hernandez," Ezra said, recognizing the man from memories that belonged to previous captains who had encountered him over the decades. "Still serving corrupt masters who profit from human misery. I see." Hernandez's eyes narrowed as he studied Ezra's transformed appearance. Something about the pirate captain seemed different, older somehow despite his unchanged physical features. "I serve the crown of Spain, not the petty ambitions of creatures like Torres. Though his information about this place has proved most valuable. Torres is dead," Ezra replied simply. "The island judged him unworthy of the knowledge he sought. Then you will provide that knowledge instead. Surrender peacefully, and your crew will be permitted to sail away unharmed." But even as Hernandez spoke, his soldiers were positioning themselves to prevent any possible escape. Their training was evident in every movement. These men had fought pirates before and understood the tactics likely to be employed against them. That's when the temple itself began to respond to the newly forged bond. The stone guardians that had previously targeted Torres now turned their attention to the Spanish intruders, their eyes blazing with protective fury. "Impossible," Hernandez breathed, watching creatures of living stone step down from their pedestals with grinding determination. "Not impossible," Ezra replied, his voice carrying the combined authority of 8 legendary captains. "Just beyond your understanding of what true leadership means." The battle that erupted in the temple chamber was unlike anything recorded in military histories. Musket balls struck the stone guardians without effect, while their massive hands swept aside trained soldiers like children's toys. But it wasn't just ancient magic defending the temple, it was the power of a crew united in purpose across impossible distance. Through the temporary bond, Ezra could sense Sarah and Old Pete mounting their own desperate fight at the harbor. Their success or failure was directly connected to his own, each victory reinforcing the others through the mystical connection that now linked them all. "Diego," Ezra called out, knowing somehow that his navigator could hear him despite the miles of stone and jungle between them. "The wind patterns are shifting. Tell Sarah to raise whatever sail we have. We'll need to leave within the hour." Even as he fought alongside the stone guardians, Ezra was coordinating a complex escape plan that drew upon centuries of accumulated tactical knowledge while adapting to their specific circumstances. The battle reached its crescendo as the temple's ancient defenses fully awakened to protect what they recognized as a worthy captain and his chosen crew. Stone guardians moved with impossible grace, their massive forms flowing like dancers as they systematically dismantled the Spanish assault with minimal violence, disarming rather than destroying, capturing rather than killing. But it was Ezra himself who proved most formidable. The temporary bond with Crimson had granted him access to the combat knowledge of 7 legendary captains, and he fought with techniques that spanned centuries of pirate warfare. His blade seemed to know where each opponent would strike before they moved, and his tactical awareness encompassed the entire battlefield as if he were observing from above. Captain Hernandez, recognizing that his carefully planned operation was collapsing, made a desperate decision. Drawing a concealed pistol, he aimed not at Ezra but at Crimson, understanding that the memory bird represented the true prize his masters sought. "Stand down, or the creature dies," he shouted over the sound of combat. The temple fell silent as even the stone guardians paused their methodical dismantling of the Spanish force. Crimson, perched calmly on Ezra's shoulder despite the chaos, seemed unperturbed by the threat to his life. "Captain Hernandez," the parrot said in a voice that carried the authority of ages, "you make the same mistake Torres made. You believe that power can be stolen rather than earned. I believe that His Catholic Majesty's interests supersede the superstitions of pirates and talking birds." But as Hernandez spoke, something extraordinary began happening throughout the temple. The mirrors started reflecting not the present scene, but moments from the past when other captains had faced similar choices. Elena Vasquez refusing to abandon wounded crew members during a Spanish attack. Marcus Reed choosing to share his ship's medical supplies with plague victims instead of selling them for profit. Mackenzie sacrificing his own escape to ensure his men reached safety. "This is what you fail to understand," Ezra said, stepping forward despite the pistol aimed at his companion. "True leadership isn't about commanding others, it's about inspiring them to become more than they thought possible." Through their bond, he could feel Sarah and old Pete working frantically at the harbor, their determination fueled not by fear of punishment, but by genuine loyalty to a captain who had proven himself worthy of such devotion. Diego was using every ounce of his navigational skill to prepare for an escape that seemed impossible, driven by the kind of faith that transforms ordinary sailors into legends. "Your crew would die for you," Hernandez observed, his military mind recognizing the tactical implications of such loyalty. "No," Ezra replied simply. "They would live for me, and I for them." That's the difference between leadership and tyranny. The United Crew's flag materialized above them as if summoned by these words, not a physical banner, but a spiritual symbol that represented everything they had built together. It showed not a traditional pirate skull or royal crest, but simple images that told their story. A compass for Diego's guidance, a cannon for Sarah's protection, a ship's wheel for old Pete's steady hands, and at the center, a memory bird whose wings sheltered them all. The flag's appearance triggered something profound in the temple's ancient mechanisms. The artifacts that had been used in the binding ceremony, the chalice, the scales, the crown of feathers, began resonating with harmonious tones that seemed to come from the mountain's very heart. "The permanent bond," Crimson said with wonder. "The temple recognizes what we've accomplished here. It's offering to make the connection eternal, despite the irregular circumstances." But even as this miraculous opportunity presented itself, Ezra could sense that time was running out. The temporary bond would fade within minutes, and Captain Hernandez still held them at gunpoint with professional patience that spoke of a man willing to wait for the perfect moment to strike. "Choose quickly, Captain Blackwood," Hernandez said. "Surrender the bird, and your crew lives. Continue this foolishness, and I'll kill it and hunt down your companions at the harbor." The final test had arrived, not from the temple's mystical guardians, but from a very human enemy who understood exactly how to strike at a leader's greatest vulnerability. Ezra could accept the permanent bond and become a legendary captain, but potentially watch his current crew die in the process. Or he could abandon this unprecedented opportunity to ensure their immediate safety. Through the fading connection, he felt Sarah's determination as she worked to repair their ship. Old Pete's unwavering loyalty as he prepared for their captain's return, and Diego's absolute faith that somehow their captain would find a way to save them all. The choice, when it came, required no deliberation at all.